The blazing August sun hung like a merciless furnace above the New Mexico territory, its rays hammering the endless expanse of alkali dust and shattered stone with relentless fury. In this wasteland, where even rattlesnakes sought refuge beneath the sparse creosote bushes, a woman's head emerged from the desert floor like some grotesque sacrifice to the pitiless sky. Abigail Hart's lips were cracked and bleeding, her auburn hair now matted with crystalline sweat and grit that cut like powdered glass. Sand had worked its way into every pore, and her emerald eyes, though clouded with agony, still burned with fierce resistance. She had been entombed up to her shoulders in the packed earth for 7 grueling hours, her body imprisoned beneath the unforgiving ground, while the temperatures soared past 120 degrees. Boot heels crunched against hardpan, announcing her tormentor's return. A tall figure in black emerged from the heat shimmer like death incarnate spurs, chiming with each calculated step. Silas Crowley stood over her, his weathered face showing no mercy. His hand rested on the ivory-handled Colt at his hip. "I'm still breathing, I see." Crowley drawled, his Texas accent thick as molasses. Most folks would have surrendered to the heat by now. Abigail tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged. She swallowed, tasting copper and grit. "Water," she whispered. Crowley's laugh was like grinding stone. "Water. That's rich considering what this whole business concerns." He knelt beside her close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath. "One word, darling. Just say yes, and my boys will dig you out right now. We'll ride back to town, have the preacher marry us proper." Despite the liquid fire coursing through her body, Abigail met his gaze with molten hatred. "Go. Straight to hell." Crowley's face hardened. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. "Next time, say yes." The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. He turned and walked to his stallion, never looking back, as her desperate pleas followed him across the wasteland. Soon, even the hoofbeats faded, leaving only the whisper of superheated wind and the ominous cry of circling vultures. 3 days earlier, on the morning of August 15th, 1869, Abigail Hart had been hanging laundry behind her family's adobe ranch house, humming a melody her late mother used to sing. At 24, she possessed both the practical strength of ranch life and the quiet dignity Margaret Hart had instilled in her daughter. Their spread occupied precious land in Perdition Valley, where water meant survival. "Abigail." Her father's voice carried worry. Thomas Hart appeared around the corner, his graying hair, disheveled hands trembling. At 53, he looked older, worn by drought and debt. "What's wrong, Pa?" She dropped the shirt she'd been hanging. Thomas glanced toward the wagon road. "Crowley's coming." Spotted his dust from the ridge. More riders this time. Abigail's stomach clenched. Silas Crowley had been courting her for 6 months, though his courtship involved ultimatums and threats about their finances. The man owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties and had the sheriff in his pocket. More crucially, he coveted their spring, the only reliable water source for 50 miles. "He can propose until doomsday," Abigail said, jaw set with stubborn determination. "My answer won't change. It ain't that simple anymore." Thomas pulled out a crumpled paper. "Bank's calling in our note, all of it, due by month's end." The amount was staggering, more than their ranch could earn in 5 years. "But you've never missed a payment." "Payments don't matter when the man who owns the bank wants your land." Thomas's voice carried bitter experience. "Should never have borrowed from his associates, but after your mother died and we lost half the herd." They knew the history. 3 years of disasters had driven Thomas to Crowley's financial web, desperate to save the ranch his grandfather had built. Now Abigail understood the true cost. Dust approached from the north, resolving into 4 riders, led by a man in black. Crowley rode like he owned everything he surveyed, which wasn't far from truth in Perdition Valley. "Stay strong," Thomas whispered. "Your mother would have wanted you to choose your own path." The riders pulled up horses snorting. Crowley dismounted with practiced elegance, his 3 companions remaining mounted: Jake Morrison, his cold-eyed foreman, Pete Valdez, a gunslinger with shark-dead eyes, and Billy Crane, barely 20, but already carrying a killer's swagger. Thomas, Miss Abigail. Crowley touched his hat. Beautiful morning, though I expect it'll get warmer. State your business, Thomas said, stepping protectively before his daughter. Direct, I like that. Crowley's smile never reached his eyes. My business concerns your daughter and our future together. I've been patient, but patience has limits. Abigail stepped beside her father. I've told you before, I won't marry you. Not today, not ever. Strong words from a woman whose family owes me $8,000. Crowley's voice carried absolute certainty. Funny how principles bend when the alternative is losing everything. There are other ways to handle debt, she replied, though they all knew better. Crowley laughed. Other ways? Like what's selling to competitors? There ain't any. Working it off at your current rate, y'all would be dead of old age before clearing half. He paused. No, there's only one solution. You marry me, the debt vanishes, your father keeps his ranch, and I get what I've wanted. You want the water rights? Abigail said flatly. Smart girl. Beauty and brains, exactly what I need. His admission came without shame. Your mother was clever too. Clever enough to ensure those rights would transfer properly. Thomas stiffened. What do you know about my wife's arrangements? More than you think. Crowley produced a document. My lawyer did research. Margaret Hart left specific instructions. Those rights can't be sold or seized for debt, only transferred through marriage or death. His smile turned predatory. Marriage is more pleasant. Abigail felt blood drain from her face. Her mother had mentioned protecting the land, but never explained fully. Last night she dreamed of her mother in moonlight, pointing north toward distant mountains and whispering about secrets hidden where the sun sets behind stone. Y'all have 3 days, Crowley continued. After that, I'll explore alternatives. And if I refuse, then your father loses his ranch anyway, and I eventually get those rights through foreclosure. He mounted with fluid grace. But I'm optimistic. I believe you'll make the sensible choice. After they left, Abigail turned to her father. Tell me everything about Mother's will. Thomas sank onto the steps. She was dying, knew Crowley wanted our land even then. Made arrangements with a Santa Fe lawyer, had papers drawn up. Said she wanted you to control your own destiny. He looked up with haunted eyes. Never thought she meant you'd choose between marriage and losing everything. That evening, watching sunset paint the desert in molten copper, Abigail made her decision. She would not be bartered away like livestock. Some things mattered more than land or water. Her freedom was one of them. She couldn't know Crowley had already decided her answer. Pre-dawn darkness on August 18th shattered under splintering wood and shouted commands. Abigail jolted awake to her father's cries and boots thundering across wooden floors. She grabbed the shotgun that had become her bedside companion. Where is she? Crowley's voice boomed. She ain't here. Thomas lied, voice strained with pain. Flesh connected with flesh, followed by a heavy thud. Don't lie to me, old man. Sun's rising, which means her time's up. Abigail pressed against the bedroom wall, shotgun clutched tight. Through the door crack, she saw lantern light moving like hunting predators. Search every corner, Crowley ordered. Morrison checked the barn. Valdez examined the smokehouse. Billy, you're with me. Heavy steps approached. Abigail raised the shotgun, knowing 2 shells wouldn't be enough, but determined to make them pay. The door exploded inward under Billy's boot. The young gunslinger stepped through with his Colt drawn, grinning like a wolf. Well, well, there's our bride-to-be. Abigail pulled both triggers. Thunder and smoke filled the room, But Billy had anticipated her desperation and thrown himself sideways. Buckshot shredded the doorframe, sending splinters flying. Before she could reload, Crowley filled the doorway, his Colt trained on her heart. "Drop it." The shotgun fell, her hands raised, eyes still blazing with fierce rebellion. "Admirable spirit," Crowley said approvingly. "Shows breeding. We'll have time for education after we're wed." "My answer hasn't changed, which is why we're taking a ride." He gestured toward the main room. "Move." Her father sat tied to a chair, lip split, left eye swelling. Blood stained his mustache. "Pa." "I'm fine, honey. Don't worry about old Tom." "But she should worry," Crowley said, holstering his weapon. "What happens to Thomas depends on her cooperation." Morrison emerged from the barn, shaking his head. "No one else, boss?" "Good. Valdez, bring horses. Billy, get rope." "Where are you taking my daughter?" Thomas struggled against his bonds. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere she can think clearly without distractions." Crowley pulled on riding gloves. "If she makes the wise choice, you'll see her soon. If not," he shrugged, "that's in her hands." Billy bound Abigail's hands behind her back, his fingers lingering more than necessary. "Be careful, Billy," Crowley warned. "Damaged goods don't make happy brides." Outside, gray pre-dawn light revealed 4 saddled horses and a wild-eyed Mustang dancing at Morrison's lead. "That spirited animal is yours, darling," Crowley said. "Thought you might appreciate something with as much fire as yourself." They bound her feet to stirrups and hands to the saddle horn. As the sun crested eastern mountains, painting sky in hammered copper and burnished gold, 5 riders headed south into the Badlands. The journey consumed 3 brutal hours across increasingly desolate terrain. They rode through dry creek beds, lined with sun-bleached bones, past towering formations carved by wind and time into grotesque sculptures. Temperature climbed steadily, soaking Abigail's clothes with perspiration. Finally, they stopped in a natural amphitheater surrounded by red sandstone cliffs. The ground here was different sand mixed with clay that would pack hard when pressed. Morrison and Billy began digging while Valdez watched, and Crowley inspected their work. "Deep enough," Crowley declared, "but not so deep she can't contemplate her situation." Abigail stared at the pit in growing horror. "You're going to bury me alive." "Only until you develop proper perspective." His tone remained conversational. "I figure a few hours will provide appropriate insight into your alternatives." They cut her bonds and dragged her to the pit despite her struggles. Morrison and Billy forced her down, while Valdez held a rifle to discourage escape. "Final opportunity," Crowley said, standing at the pit's edge. "Agree to marry me, and we ride back immediately. Perfect timing for a sunrise ceremony." Abigail looked up from her sandy grave earth, already cascading down. She heard her mother's voice from the dream again, whispering about northern secrets, and realized the true meaning. But she'd die before revealing that to this monster. "I'd rather die first." "No, you wouldn't, but you might reconsider." He nodded to his men. "Proceed." Sand descended in steady shovelfuls, burying legs, waist, chest. She fought desperately, but Earth's weight held her fast. Soon only her neck and head remained above ground, packed sand forming an earthen prison. "Let the desert judge her pride," Crowley said, mounting his stallion. He looked down one final time, expression devoid of mercy. "We'll return in a few hours to see if the heat has clarified your thinking." Hoofbeats faded quickly, leaving only superheated wind and ominous carrion birds beginning their patient circles. The sun climbed toward zenith, transforming the amphitheater into a furnace. Abigail felt moisture being drawn from her skin, with each passing minute, lips cracking as dehydration set in with frightening speed. Packed sand around her neck absorbed and reflected heat like a kiln, making each breath feel like swallowing molten metal. She tried rotating her head for shade, but the pit had been positioned with calculated cruelty for maximum sun exposure. Worse movement only settled the sand tighter around her chest and shoulders, making it harder to expand her lungs. Within the first hour, insects found her. Ants emerged from disturbed colonies following scent trails to her helpless form. They crawled across her face with tiny feet, investigating nostrils and eye corners with scientific precision. She could blow them from mouth and nose, but those reaching her ears or forehead were beyond her limited ability to discourage. A desert beetle landed on her cheek, exploring salt residue from evaporating sweat. Its shell was hard and sharp-edged, scratching sunburned skin as it moved mechanically. She shook her head violently enough to dislodge it, but the effort left her dizzy and gasping. Physical torment matched psychological warfare. Every overhead shadow might herald rescue or announce the vultures Crowley had mentioned. She strained to identify each speck in the distant sky, hope and terror, alternating with each dark shape appearing and vanishing among thermal columns. By the third hour, hallucinations crept into her vision. Rock formations seemed to shift and breathe. She thought she saw her mother at the pit's edge, beckoning with sorrowful eyes and pointing north toward some distant salvation. But when she blinked, the vision dissolved into heat, shimmer, and stone. Her throat had constricted to a painful whisper. Swallowing became an agonizing reminder of desperate thirst. Face skin felt tight and hot, already blistering, despite efforts to keep her head tilted down. Even her scalp burned, where hair parted merciless sun finding every vulnerable inch. She tried conserving energy by remaining motionless, but enforced immobility brought its own torture. Muscles cramped in unadjustable positions, pins and needles shot through buried limbs, and constant chest pressure made every breath conscious effort requiring tremendous will. Worse than physical suffering was growing realization that Crowley might not return. What if he'd decided a dead Abigail would be easier to manage? Rights might transfer through probate court as easily as marriage. And corpses couldn't testify about kidnapping and murder. As the fourth hour dragged past, even her iron resolve wavered. The rational part pointed out that survival trumped pride, that living through this would provide opportunities to escape later. Death offered no future possibilities. But then she remembered her mother's face during those final days when cancer consumed her from within, and pain was beyond endurance. Margaret Hart had never surrendered, never stopped fighting, never let suffering break her spirit. She'd used her last clear moments to arrange legal protections, even knowing it might endanger Abigail. Some things are worth more than survival, her mother had whispered near the end. Your soul is one of them. Abigail closed her eyes, seeking that same strength. If death was the price of maintaining honor and freedom, she'd pay it without complaint. Crowley could have her corpse, but never her willing submission. The decision brought strange peace, even as her body continued deteriorating. She began thinking about the desert surrounding her, not as prison, but as cathedral of stone and sky, where she might meet her end with dignity intact. There were worse places to die than under the limitless blue heaven her mother had loved. But then, drifting between consciousness and heat-induced delirium, she heard something that didn't belong to the desert's natural symphony. Hoofbeats. Not multiple riders, but the steady rhythm of a single horse approaching from northern wastes. Hope flared like a struck match, followed immediately by fear. If this was Crowley returning alone, her situation had worsened. But if it was someone else, anyone else, she might still have salvation. She tried calling out, but only a croak emerged. Hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by Spur's musical jingle and Leather's familiar creak. Whoever approached had stopped just beyond her sight. Then she heard boots on sand-measured steps approaching. Blessed shadow fell across her face, blissfully cool for the first time in hours. "Well, I'll be damned," said a voice she'd never heard before, carrying Kansas Plains accent. "What in hell happened to you, lady?" Jesse Boone knelt beside the buried woman-weathered hands, reaching for his canteen with practiced efficiency. At 31, he carried himself with careful economy of movement from years surviving on the frontier. But his gray eyes held compassion that Army service and hard living hadn't extinguished. He'd been riding the outlaw trail for 3 years, not from criminal inclination, but because a carpetbagger judge in Kansas had decided Union veterans deserved to lose their farms like everyone else. "Don't try speaking yet," he advised, gently tilting the canteen to let precious drops touch her cracked lips. "Let's extract you from this predicament first, then sort out particulars." He began digging with his hands, scooping sand with efficiency of a man who'd excavated his share of graves and foxholes. The packed earth came away in chunks, revealing the true extent of her imprisonment. Someone had buried her methodically, ensuring maximum suffering while keeping her technically alive. This wasn't random. Jesse muttered, sweat dripping from his brow. "Whoever did this wanted you to suffer, but also wanted you conscious long enough to think about something specific. Suggests personal grudge with financial implications." As more of her body was freed, Jesse could see bruises where ropes had bitten into flesh. Her dress was torn hair matted with sand, and perspiration exposed skin showing angry red of severe sunburn. But she was alive, which in this heat was miraculous. When he finally pulled her free, Abigail collapsed into his arms like a broken doll. He carried her to shade of an overhanging ledge and began treating heat exposure with battlefield medic's care. Small water sips wet cloth on forehead and wrists, loosening clothing for circulation and cooling. "Take it slow," he advised as she tried drinking too quickly. "Too much water too fast will make you violently ill." It required nearly an hour before Abigail could speak clearly. When she did, her story emerged in halting whispers that grew stronger as her voice returned. "My name is Abigail Hart. I own a ranch in Perdition Valley with my father. This morning, 4 armed men kidnapped me. Their leader, Silas Crowley, wants to force me into marriage to gain legal control of our water rights." Jesse's expression darkened like storm clouds. "I know that name. Crowley runs cattle through this territory, has a reputation for acquiring what he desires and eliminating objections." He studied her face carefully. "But burying someone alive, that's extreme even by his standards." He said he'd return in a few hours to see if the desert changed my perspective. Abigail struggled to sit upright. "That was how long ago?" Jesse consulted the sun's position with practiced eye. "Based on your condition and shadow angles, I'd estimate 5 or 6 hours, which means he might be heading back soon." He walked to where his horse grazed on sparse grass. "We need to leave immediately." As Jesse helped her to unsteady feet, Abigail got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was tall and lean with deep tan from years under open sky, an easy way of moving that marked him comfortable in hostile country. His clothes were practical worn leather vest, denim pants, boots that had walked many miles. A Colt Peacemaker rode low on his right hip with casual familiarity, and a Winchester rifle was secured to his saddle within reach. Everything suggested competence and hard-won survival skills. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as he lifted her onto his horse. "Because no one deserves to die like that," Jesse replied, swinging up behind her. "And because I've developed a powerful dislike for men who prey on women and call it business." They rode north from the burial site, Jesse's trained eye constantly scanning for pursuit, while choosing their path with tactical precision. He avoided soft sand showing clear tracks and stayed to rocky ground where possible. But knew skilled trackers could follow even the most careful rider. Crowley's men had likely learned their trade during the war. After an hour through increasingly broken country, they stopped at a small oasis where natural spring fed a pool surrounded by ancient cottonwoods. Jesse helped Abigail down and began setting up temporary camp in the largest tree's shelter. We'll rest until darkness, then travel again. He explained, eyes never ceasing their terrain patrol. Move at night, hide during day. Safest approach when outnumbered by professionals. As Abigail cleaned wounds in spring water, she studied her mysterious rescuer. You're not from this territory. Kansas originally. Been drifting since carpetbaggers decided they needed my land more than I did. Jesse was checking weapons with professional soldiers' efficiency. Used to farm corn and wheat until the bank decided foreclosure was more profitable than honest interest. Crowley isn't just pursuing me, Abigail said, wincing as cold water touched sunburned skin. He's trying to control all water in Perdition Valley. If he gets our spring, he'll have a monopoly on the most precious resource in 3 counties. Men like Crowley are never satisfied with enough. Jesse observed, sliding fresh cartridges into his rifle's magazine. They keep taking until someone stops them, or they destroy themselves through greed. As they talked, Abigail understood Jesse represented more than just a drifting cowboy. His tactical knowledge, security attention, familiarity with violence all pointed to extensive combat experience. "Not you were a soldier," she stated with growing certainty. "Union cavalry. Served under General Sherman during his Georgia March, then spent 2 years chasing Apaches for territorial government." Jesse's voice carried no pride, only bone-deep weariness of a man who'd witnessed too much death. "Thought I was finished with fighting when I hung up my uniform. But conflict has a way of finding me." As evening approached and desert began cooling, they shared Jesse's meager rations and planned next moves. Abigail insisted on returning to Perdition Valley to help her father and retrieve legal documents proving their water rights ownership. That's probably exactly what Crowley expects. Jesse warned, military experience making him cautious. Returning home gives him every advantage. "He has my father," Abigail replied with quiet intensity. "I cannot abandon him to face Crowley's vengeance alone." Jesse studied her determined face and their small fire's flickering light. "You're absolutely committed to this. Wouldn't you be?" He nodded slowly, remembering his own father back in Kansas. "Yeah, I reckon I would be. But we approach this intelligently, not desperately. Crowley has men and guns and legal authority. All we have is surprise and the fact he doesn't know you've escaped." As they prepared to leave the oasis under darkness cover, neither noticed the distant glint of starlight reflecting off spyglass lens. Miles away on a high ridge overlooking the spring, a lone figure lowered his telescope and began preparing for long night ride. Jack Morrison, Crowley's foreman and most skilled tracker, had found their trail. But Morrison carried a secret that would change everything. 3 days earlier, he'd received a letter from his brother Samuel, a preacher in Santa Fe, asking him to watch for Union cavalry veteran Jesse Boone. The letter mentioned Jesse had served with distinction under Sherman and might be in the territory. What it didn't mention, but what Morrison had pieced together from military records, was that Jesse Boone had once saved Samuel Morrison's life during a Georgia skirmish. Morrison faced a choice defining not only his fate, but everyone involved in Crowley's scheme. Loyalty to his employer or an old debt of honor, transcending business arrangements. The hunt was about to become far more complex than anyone anticipated. They traveled through night across terrain designed to break both horses and riders. Jesse led them through labyrinth of arroyos and broken country, utilizing every cavalry trick to obscure their trail. But as dawn approached and they sought shelter in Mesquite Grove, he couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes watched their every move. "Something's not right," he muttered, studying landscape through field glasses with increasing unease. Abigail, who had been dozing against his chest as they rode through cool night air, stirred awake. "What troubles you?" "Can't say for certain. Maybe nothing more than nerves. But I've got an itch between my shoulder blades that usually means someone's drawing a bead on me." Jesse dismounted and began setting up cold camp in the grove's densest part. "We'll rest during daylight, but keep everything packed for immediate departure. As Abigail tended wounds with medical supplies from Jesse's saddlebags, she began telling him more about her family's situation. The story revealed complexity far beyond simple greed over water rights. My mother died 3 years ago this coming winter, she explained, wincing as she cleaned a deep forearm cut. Cancer consumed her from inside, but she remained sharp until her final breath. During her last weeks, she spent countless hours with a Santa Fe lawyer, making elaborate arrangements. What sort of arrangements? Jesse asked military experience, having taught him to be suspicious of complex legal maneuvers. She knew Crowley wanted our land even then. He'd made several purchase offers, always polite on surface, but with that threat undertone that made your skin crawl. Abigail paused, memory bringing pain beyond physical injuries. Mother was far more intelligent than any of us credited. She had papers drawn protecting the water rights in ways we didn't understand until this week. Jesse finished checking their perimeter and settled beside her in dappled shade. How so? The rights can't be sold to outsiders, can't be seized for debt through normal legal channels, can't be taken through foreclosure proceedings. They can only be transferred through marriage or death, and only to specific parties. Abigail's voice grew bitter with understanding. Mother thought she was protecting me by giving me control, but she also made me a target. Crowley can't acquire the water unless he marries me or kills me. But there's something more to this situation, isn't there? Jesse's experience with legal complications had taught him to look for hidden clauses and unexpected provisions. Abigail nodded reluctantly, hand moving unconsciously to her bodice. But before she could respond, something made her hesitate. That dream kept returning her mother, pointing north, whispering about secrets. Maybe she wasn't ready to share everything yet. Not until she understood Jesse's true intentions. There might be, she said carefully. But I need to think about it more. Jesse noticed her evasion, but didn't press. Everyone had secrets in this country. As they discussed the situation in hushed tones, Nathan noticed the figure moving through the mesquite grove, using morning shadows to mask his approach. Jack Morrison had been following since midnight, reading sign invisible to most men, but clear to someone who'd learned his deadly trade hunting Apaches in the same desert. Morrison had served in Crowley's private army for 5 years, earning his position through ruthless efficiency and absolute loyalty. He'd killed 11 men in service to Crowley's ambitions and felt no qualms about adding 2 more. But as he crept closer, something made him pause. Years of working for Crowley had taught him to question his employer's true motives, especially when large sums of money were involved. And lately Morrison had begun to wonder if he was getting his fair share of the profits from Crowley's various enterprises. These thoughts were churning through his mind when his boot struck loose rock. The sound was small, barely more than whisper, but in desert silence it might as well have been gunshot. Jesse's head snapped up with reflexes of a man who'd survived too many ambushes. "Someone's out there," Morrison cursed silently and made his decision. Rather than retreating to report back as planned, he would capture both fugitives himself and use the opportunity to renegotiate his relationship with Crowley. He stepped into the open with rifle aimed at Jesse's chest. "Don't move, either of you. Hands where I can see them." Jesse slowly raised his hands, but his eyes calculated distances and angles with tactical mind. Morrison was good, very good, but alone in unfamiliar terrain, which created opportunities. Jack Morrison, Abigail said, recognizing Crowley's foreman. "I should have known he'd send his best hunting dog." "Nothing personal, Miss Hart," Morrison replied, though rifle grip never wavered. "Just business, though I'm thinking the business arrangements might need some renegotiation." "You're not taking us back to Crowley," Jesse said quietly. "Oh, I'm taking you back, but maybe not in the condition he's expecting." Morrison's smile was cold as winter stone. "See, I've been working for table scraps, while my boss sits on potential fortunes. That doesn't seem fair." Before anyone could respond, sharp rifle crack echoed across desert. Morrison spun halfway around red stain, spreading across his shirt front, and crashed face first into sand. From behind boulder 50 yards away, Pete Valdez lowered his smoking Winchester and began walking toward them with weapon trained on Jesse. "Sorry about that, Jack," Valdez called conversationally. "But Mr. Crowley don't pay us to think. He pays us to follow orders." Pete Valdez was everything Morrison had been, with the additional quality of being completely without conscience. Where Morrison had operated by some twisted professional ethics, Valdez killed for simple pleasure of watching life leave a man's eyes. He'd been with Crowley for 2 years, ever since fleeing a New Mexico murder warrant, and had earned his wages by solving problems requiring permanent solutions. "On your feet, both of you," Valdez ordered, keeping rifle centered on Jesse's chest. "Slow and easy. Any sudden moves and I'll put a bullet through your spine." Jesse helped Abigail stand mind-racing through possibilities. Valdez was positioned perfectly too far for a rush, too close to miss, with good cover and clear fields of fire. The man had military training and knew how to handle prisoners. "Where's Crowley?" Abigail asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Waiting about 2 miles north with Billy. We figured Morrison could track you easy enough, but the boss wanted backup ready." Valdez's tobacco-stained grin revealed yellowed teeth. Guess he was right about that. As they walked across open desert Valdez, keeping careful distance, Jesse studied terrain for any advantage. The land was broken and harsh, perfect for ambushes, but terrible for escape when already under the gun. "You killed your own partner." Jesse observed, testing Valdez's mental state. Morrison was getting ideas above his station. Started thinking about renegotiating, which ain't healthy in our line of work. Valdez spat tobacco juice. "Besides, Mr. Crowley pays me enough to buy loyalty." They crested a low ridge and saw the rest of Crowley's party waiting in shade of a towering red rock formation. Silas Crowley sat his stallion like an emperor, while Billy Crane lounged against a boulder trying to look dangerous. Both straightened as prisoners approached. "Well, well," Crowley said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Miss Hart looking worse for wear, and you must be the Good Samaritan who interfered with my business." "Jesse Boone," Jesse replied evenly. "And if you call burying a woman alive business, then your business needs serious revision." Crowley laughed genuinely. "Direct and morally superior. Normally I'd just shoot you for the inconvenience, but I'm curious." He walked closer, studying Jesse's face intently. "You have the bearing of a soldier. Cavalry, I'd guess. Which side?" "Union." "Ah, that explains the rescue instinct. You boys always had unfortunate tendency toward heroics." Crowley turned his attention back to Abigail, expression hardening. "And you, my dear, have caused me considerable trouble. The original offer is no longer available." "What do you mean?" Crowley pulled the legal document from his coat. "I had my lawyer do more research after our conversation. Seems your mother was even more clever than I initially credited. Water rights were just the beginning, weren't they?" Abigail's face went white as she realized what he discovered. "There's something about this will that doesn't quite add up." Crowley continued studying the document with suspicious eyes. "The language is more complex than necessary for simple water rights. Your mother was protecting something else, wasn't she? Something more valuable." Now Abigail's dream made terrible sense. Her mother's whispered words about secrets hidden where the sun sets behind stone, the northern mountains where Aunt Sarah's claim lay. The will wasn't just about their ranch at all, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." Crowley's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." He nodded to his men. "Billy, tie them both up. Valdez, start gathering wood for a fire." "A fire?" Abigail's voice cracked. "Desert nights get cold." I want you comfortable while we wait for legal formalities." Crowley's smile contained no warmth. "You see, I've discovered that if you die without being married mineral rights, if there are any, revert to territorial government for auction. But if you die as my wife, they transfer to me automatically." "You're talking about murder," Jesse said. "I'm talking about business. Your interference has simply accelerated my timeline." He checked his pocket watch. "I've sent for a preacher and witnesses. Should arrive by sunset." As Billy secured them with rope and Valdez built a fire, they were forced to wait through the long hours. But as full darkness settled and the fire burned to coals, no preacher appeared. Crowley's confidence began showing cracks. "Now where the hell is he?" Billy asked around midnight. "Probably got lost," Valdez suggested without conviction. Crowley paced like a caged animal. "He should have been here hours ago, unless someone in town warned him." His face darkened with suspicion. "Change of plans. We head back to town at first light." Jesse and Abigail spent the night bound back to back near the dying fire, taking what warmth they could. Their proximity allowed whispered conversation. "I'm working on these ropes." Jesse breathed into her ear. "There's something I haven't told you." Abigail whispered back. "About the will and what my mother was really protecting." "What is it?" She hesitated, then decided to trust him completely. "The valuable deposits aren't on our ranch. My mother was protecting her sister's claim, my Aunt Sarah's land, about 10 miles north. The will uses our property as legal fiction to hide the real location." Jesse paused in his rope work. "You mean Crowley is going through all this for rights to deposits that don't exist, where he thinks they do?" "Exactly. And Sarah died last winter. Her land belongs to territorial government, now open for legal claim by anyone with proper paperwork. First, we get free." Jesse managed to loosen another loop. "Then we worry about mining claims." But their conversation hadn't gone unnoticed. Valdez, pretending to sleep, had heard enough to understand his employer was chasing the wrong prize. Like Morrison before him, he saw opportunity. But unlike Morrison, he was smart enough to keep quiet until he could act. Dawn was still hours away when everything erupted into chaos. The storm that had been building in northern mountains finally broke, with nature's full fury sending torrents of rainwater cascading down normally dry creek beds in a wall of destruction audible for miles. The first sign was a low rumble that seemed to rise from Earth itself, vibrating through boot soles with approaching freight trains' power. Jesse felt it immediately, cavalry experience in flash flood country, making his blood run cold. "Flash flood!" he shouted, struggling against loosened bonds. "Everyone get to high ground now." The rumble grew to deafening roar as a wall of muddy water, uprooted trees, and deadly debris came rushing through the narrow canyon where they'd camped. The flood represented combined runoff from cloudbursts 20 miles north, where summer thunderstorms had dumped inches of rain in minutes onto ground, too hard to absorb the deluge. Crowley and his men scrambled frantically for higher ground as the surge crashed through their campsite like divine wrath, sweeping away supplies, scattering horses into darkness, and turning their strategic position into a death trap. In the chaos, Jesse finally slipped his bonds completely and grabbed Abigail, pulling her up onto a narrow ledge carved into the canyon wall by centuries of erosion. But their respite lasted only seconds before the second disaster struck, with calculated precision. Sharp rifle cracks echoed off canyon walls, not random panic shooting, but disciplined volleys of a man who knew his deadly business. Pete Valdez had made his play for control and wealth. During the flood's confusion, he'd positioned himself on high ground opposite their ledge and opened fire on his own companions. His first shot took Billy Crane in the chest, and the heavy slug spinning the young gunman like a child's toy and dropping him into rushing water where he vanished beneath muddy current. His second shot forced Crowley to dive desperately for cover behind a massive boulder, cursing his employee's betrayal as bullets whined off stone around him. Nothing personal, Mr. Crowley, Valdez called over the flood's thunderous roar. But I hear there might be more to this deal than you've been sharing. Jesse realized Valdez had overheard their conversation about the real mineral locations and was making his bid to control the entire situation. But the gunman had made fatal miscalculations. Crowley hadn't built his empire by being easily outmaneuvered. The cattle baron had survived range wars, Apache raids, and business rivalries that had killed harder men. When he decided to fight back, it would be with swift calculation of a predator who'd learned to kill or be killed. The battle that followed would rage for hours, transforming the canyon into a hellscape of violence, rising water, and desperate survival. The extended climax, 1,200 plus words. Crowley's return fire came immediate and devastatingly accurate. His ivory-handled Colt barked twice in rapid succession muzzle flashes, lighting his grim face in the darkness. The first bullet caught Valdez in the left shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain and rage. The slug tore through muscle and sinew, sending arterial blood spraying across the rock face behind him. The second shot chipped stone inches from Valdez's head, razor-sharp fragments slicing across his cheek and drawing fresh lines of crimson. But the wounded gunman was far from finished. Blood streaming down his arm, he shifted position among the rocks, using terrain for protection, and continued his methodical assault with cold precision of a professional killer. "You always were too greedy for your own good, Crowley," Valdez shouted over the water's roar, working his rifle's lever with mechanical efficiency. His next shot sparked off the boulder, shielding his former employer, showering Crowley with stinging stone chips. The flood continued rising, carrying with it the debris of destruction, entire cottonwood trees, boulders the size of wagon wheels, the bloated corpses of cattle caught in the deluge. The noise was indescribable. A hellish combination of rushing water-grinding stone and the screams of dying men that seemed to emerge from the very depths of perdition. Jesse and Abigail found themselves trapped on their precarious ledge, caught between the rising torrent below and the crossfire above. The ledge, carved by centuries of seasonal floods, was slick with spray and narrow as a man's coffin. One wrong step would send them plunging into the churning maelstrom. "We need to move higher," Jesse shouted into Abigail's ear, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. The water had risen another 3 feet in just minutes, and debris was beginning to strike the canyon walls with bone-jarring impacts. They began working their way along the treacherous ledge backs, pressed against the rock face feet, testing each step for stability. The stone was slick with moisture and algae from previous floods, making every movement a gamble with death. A bullet from Valdez's rifle suddenly whined past Jesse's head, so close he felt the heat of its passage. The slug struck the rock wall behind him, sending up a shower of needle-sharp splinters that peppered his neck and shoulders with tiny wounds. "Get down!" Jesse pulled Abigail against the canyon wall as another shot rang out, this one aimed at Crowley, but ricocheting wildly off the stone surfaces. The cattle baron had found better cover behind a formation of boulders and was returning fire with methodical patience. His third shot took Valdez in the right thigh, the impact spinning the gunman around and dropping him to one knee. But Valdez simply gritted his teeth against the pain and kept shooting, his rifle working like a deadly metronome. Jesse spotted a loose stone the size of a man's head, balanced on a narrow projection above Valdez's position. Drawing on his military training in field improvisation, he picked up a smaller rock and hurled it with all his strength at the precarious stone. The impact sent the larger rock tumbling down, striking Valdez a glancing blow on the head and disrupting his aim just as he fired at Crowley. The shot went wide, but the momentary distraction gave Crowley the opening he needed. The cattle baron's next bullet took Valdez in the left side, punching through his ribs and spinning him around. Blood fountained from the wound, but the gunman managed to keep his feet and continue firing, driven by pain-fueled rage and the prospect of vast wealth. "Nixgar, you're a dead man, Crowley," Valdez screamed, working his rifle's action despite the blood flowing freely from multiple wounds. Dead man. But as he spoke, disaster struck from an unexpected quarter. The rising floodwater, now nearly 15 feet above its normal level, began undermining the canyon walls themselves. Centuries-old layers of sedimentary rock saturated with water and subjected to unprecedented pressure began to crack and shift. A section of the canyon wall above their heads suddenly gave way, with a grinding roar sending tons of stone crashing down into the narrow gorge. Jesse grabbed Abigail and pressed them both against the rock face as basketball-sized chunks of limestone bounced and tumbled around them. One piece struck Abigail's left calf, tearing through her dress and opening a gash that immediately began bleeding profusely. She cried out in pain, but managed to keep her footing on the treacherous ledge. "I'm all right," she gasped, though blood was already soaking through the torn fabric. "Keep moving." They continued their desperate traverse along the ledge as the battle raged on around them. Valdez, despite his multiple wounds, had found a new position that gave him clear fields of fire at both Crowley and their ledge. His next shot was aimed directly at Jesse. The bullet struck the rock face just inches from Jesse's right shoulder, the impact sending up a shower of stone fragments that cut into his arm and drew blood. He lost his grip momentarily and nearly fell, saved only by Abigail's quick grab at his gun belt. But the near miss gave Jesse an idea. He still carried his service revolver, though he'd been reluctant to use it while trying to keep their location concealed. Now, with bullets flying around them anyway, concealment was pointless. Drawing his Colt with practiced speed, Jesse aimed carefully at Valdez's position and squeezed the trigger. The heavy .45 slug struck the rock near the gunman's head, forcing him to duck for cover and disrupting his fire pattern. "Now that's for the lady," Jesse shouted, firing again. This second shot was closer, clipping the edge of Valdez's cover and sending stone chips flying into his face. But Jesse's shots had also attracted Crowley's attention. The cattle baron, seeing Jesse armed and dangerous, began directing some of his fire toward the ledge, where the couple clung to life. "Should have minded your own business, cavalry boy." Crowley's voice carried clearly over the water's roar. His next shot was aimed directly at Jesse's center mass. Only Jesse's combat reflexes saved him. He threw himself sideways, pulling Abigail with him, just as Crowley's bullet sparked off the stone where he'd been standing. But the sudden movement on the slick ledge proved disastrous. Jesse's boots lost their purchase on the wet rock, and he began to slide toward the edge and the raging torrent below. His fingers scrabbled desperately for handholds as gravity pulled him inexorably toward death. Abigail, ignoring the pain from her wounded leg, lunged forward and grabbed his wrist with both hands. "I've got you," but her grip was slipping, and Jesse's weight was pulling them both toward the edge. Below them, the flood had risen even higher, and massive tree trunks were now smashing against the canyon walls with impacts that shook the stone beneath their feet. That's when Crowley made his move. Seeing Jesse helpless and Abigail distracted, the cattle baron abandoned his cover and began working his way toward their position. His face was a mask of rage and determination, his Colt held ready for the killing shot. "End of the line for both of you," he snarled, climbing steadily toward their ledge. Jesse managed to pull himself back from the brink with Abigail's help, but they were now cornered with nowhere to run. Crowley approached from one side, Valdez continued firing from above, and the deadly flood raged below. But as Crowley reached their ledge and raised his pistol for the final shot, Abigail played her most desperate card. "The silver isn't on our land," she shouted, her words carrying clearly over the chaos. "It never was." Crowley hesitated, his overwhelming greed warring with his murderous rage. In that crucial moment of hesitation, Jesse struck. Drawing on every skill learned in desperate cavalry charges, he launched himself at the cattle baron just as Crowley's finger began to tighten on the trigger. The two men crashed together on the narrow ledge, fighting desperately for control of the weapon. But Crowley was stronger and more desperate. As they grappled, he managed to wrap his powerful hands around Abigail's throat, his fingers digging into her windpipe with crushing force. "If I can't have the silver, then nobody can," he screamed over the flood's roar. Abigail clawed at his hands, her vision beginning to darken as oxygen was cut off. In her desperation, she bit down hard on Crowley's thumb, her teeth sinking deep into flesh and drawing blood. Crowley howled in pain and momentarily loosened his grip, giving Abigail precious seconds to breathe. But his hands quickly found her throat again, and this time, his grip was even more vicious. Jesse, seeing her desperate situation, abandoned his attempt to control Crowley's gun and focused all his strength on breaking the stranglehold. The three-way fight was decided by terrain rather than skill. As they struggled at the very edge of the ledge, Crowley's boots slipped on stone made treacherous by spray from the raging torrent. For a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the brink, still clutching Abigail's throat, threatening to drag them all into the flood. Jesse could have let him fall, but some remnant of his military code wouldn't allow it. He grabbed for Crowley's outstretched hand, trying to pull him to safety, even as the man attempted to murder the woman he was coming to love. But Crowley, in his panic and rage, mistook the rescue attempt for an attack. Instead of accepting help, he tried to pull Jesse down with him, his grip still locked around Abigail's throat in final spite. The result was inevitable. All three lost their precarious hold and plunged toward the muddy torrent that would either carry them to safety or crush them against the canyon walls. End of extended climax. Jesse hit the churning water first, and the impact driving air from his lungs and tumbling him head over heels in the violent current. The flood was shockingly cold and filled with debris that could crush bones, tree branches, chunks of stone, pieces of destroyed buildings from settlements upstream. Twice, Jesse was pulled under by the current's power debris-laden water, filling his nose and mouth as he fought desperately to reach the surface. The first time a submerged tree branch caught him across the chest, nearly breaking his ribs and dragging him deeper into the muddy hell. He managed to break free and surface gasping for air, only to be pulled under again by a whirlpool formed around a massive boulder. This time, he was underwater for nearly a minute, his lungs burning before the current spat him out downstream. The third near drowning came when he was trapped beneath an entire uprooted cottonwood tree, its massive trunk pinning him underwater, while branches clawed at his clothes and skin. Only by twisting out of his vest and sacrificing precious seconds was he able to escape and reach air again. But the same current that threatened to kill him also carried him away from Valdez's rifle fire and around a bend in the canyon. He managed to grab a floating piece of cottonwood and use it to stay afloat while the flood swept him through rapids and around sharp turns. Abigail had been lighter and less encumbered when she fell, and managed to grab a sturdy tree branch that kept her head above water. The current carried her along the canyon wall until she was able to grab an overhanging root and pull herself onto another narrow ledge, gasping and choking, but alive. Crowley's fate was less fortunate. Weighted down by his heavy coat boots and gun belt, he disappeared beneath the muddy water within seconds and never resurfaced. Whether he drowned, was crushed by debris, or swept so far downstream that rescue was impossible, no one would ever know. His body was never recovered. Valdez, watching from his sniper position as both his employer and primary obstacle vanished into the churning water, began working his way down toward where Abigail clung to her precarious sanctuary. His shoulder and side wounds were painful, but not disabling. And he still had his rifle and ammunition. More importantly, he now controlled the only person who could lead him to the real silver deposits that would make him wealthy beyond dreams. "Well, Miss Hart," he called as he approached her position voice, carrying across the gradually quieting canyon. "Looks like it's just you and me now, and we have some very profitable business to discuss." Valdez approached with casual confidence of a man holding every advantage. His rifle remained trained on her with professional steadiness despite his blood-soaked shoulder. The floodwaters below continued their rampage, but were already beginning to recede. "And now then, about that silver your family's been hiding," Valdez said, settling onto a boulder where he could cover her position while staying beyond reach. "I heard what you told Crowley about your aunt's property. Most interesting information. And Jesse is dead because of your greed," Abigail said, voice hollow with grief and exhaustion. Jesse knew the risks when he decided to play hero. That's on him. Valdez winced as he shifted his wounded shoulder. But his sacrifice doesn't have to be meaningless. You help me locate that silver, and I'll make sure you get a fair share of the proceeds. And if I refuse, Valdez shrugged philosophically. Then you die right here, and I spend the next few months searching every abandoned claim in the territory until I find the right location. Takes longer, but I'll get there eventually. Abigail studied her captor carefully, noting how he favored his wounded shoulder and the pain lines around his eyes. Valdez was dangerous, but hurt, and he needed her alive and cooperative. That gave her small negotiating power. My aunt's land lies about 10 miles north of our ranch, she said slowly. But the claim has reverted to territorial government. Even if you find silver, you can't legally mine it without proper paperwork. Leave the legal complications to me. I've got contacts who can smooth out those problems for reasonable percentage. Valdez gestured toward the flooding canyon. Right now, we need to get out of here before the next surge. They picked their way carefully down from the ledge, Valdez maintaining distance while keeping clear fields of fire. The receding water had left behind chaos of mud debris and scattered equipment. Billy Crane's body was wedged against a downstream boulder, his gun belt still intact. Valdez retrieved the weapons methodically. Of Silas Crowley there remained no sign. Might have survived. Valdez observed, studying the muddy water with professional interest. Could be walking out of the desert right now, planning his next move. But I wouldn't bet money on those odds. They found 2 horses that had escaped the flood, both spooked but uninjured. Valdez forced Abigail to mount one while controlling the other, using rope to link their reins so she couldn't escape. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Back to town first to see what's left of Crowley's operation. If he's really dead, there might be confusion about who's in charge. Perfect opportunity for a smart man to restore order." Valdez's tobacco-stained grin was cold. "After that, we take a ride north to examine your aunt's property." But as they traveled through morning heat, they encountered evidence that news of the night's events had already spread. They passed riders heading south toward the canyon men, Abigail recognized as townspeople from Perdition Valley. "Somebody heard all that gunfire," Valdez muttered, steering their horses into cover. "Won't take long before they find bodies and start asking questions. Questions you can't answer without implicating yourself in kidnapping and murder," Abigail pointed out, "which is why we're not going back to town. Change of plans." Valdez studied the distant riders until they disappeared. "We head directly north to your aunt's claim. I'll figure out the legal complications later." They rode hard through afternoon heat, pushing horses beyond normal limits across increasingly rugged terrain. Valdez's wounds were clearly bothering him more than he admitted, and by evening his face was gray with pain and blood loss. But his rifle grip never wavered, and his security attention remained paranoid. When they stopped to rest at a small spring, he positioned himself to observe all approaches, while keeping Abigail under constant surveillance. "Tell me about this aunt of yours," he demanded as they shared his remaining provisions. "What kind of woman was she?" "Sarah was my mother's younger sister. Never married, lived alone on a hardscrabble claim as far from civilization as you could get." Abigail stared into the small fire Valdez had built. "She was tough as rawhide and twice as stubborn. Spent 20 years working a claim that barely produced enough gold to keep her in supplies. But she found silver. According to the survey my mother commissioned, yes. But Sarah died before she could develop the claim properly. Heart attack during a winter storm alone in her cabin." Abigail's voice carried genuine grief. She deserved better than dying alone. Valdez showed no interest in her emotional state. "How much silver enough to justify the risks I'm taking?" The survey indicated significant deposits, but extraction would require major investment. Mining equipment, transportation, skilled workers. Abigail shook her head. More than one man could handle alone. That's where business partners come in. Men with capital looking for profitable investments. Valdez checked his pocket watch. We'll reach your aunt's claim tomorrow morning. Once I've verified the silver is real, I'll know how to proceed. But as they prepared to sleep in his shifts, neither saw the figure moving carefully through darkness beyond the firelight. Jesse Boone had survived his plunge into the flood, battered and nearly drowned, but very much alive. Through skill, desperation, and pure luck, he'd spent the entire day following their trail, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, while close enough to maintain visual contact. His clothes were still damp, his body ached from impacts with debris, and he'd lost most of his equipment in the torrent. But his determination to rescue Abigail had only grown stronger. Now, as Valdez dozed fitfully and Abigail sat bound to a mesquite tree under brilliant stars, Jesse began his final approach. The rescue would require perfect timing and more luck than any reasonable man should expect. But Jesse had learned that desperate situations called for audacious solutions. He checked his recovered Colt one final time and began moving silently toward the camp. Jesse waited until the deepest part of night, when Valdez's pain and exhaustion had finally overcome his professional caution. The wounded gunman had dozed while sitting upright against a boulder rifle across his knees, but grip relaxed in vulnerable sleep. Moving with silent precision learned during cavalry reconnaissance missions, Jesse crept through sparse vegetation until he was close enough to see individual hairs in Valdez's mustache. One more step, and the man would be within reach for a silent takedown. But Pete Valdez was too experienced to sleep deeply in hostile territory. Some primitive instinct brought him awake, just as Jesse's shadow fell across his face. The gunman's reaction was instantaneous and professional. He rolled sideways while bringing his rifle up in the same motion finger, finding the trigger even as his eyes focused on the threat. Years of similar situations had honed his reflexes to supernatural sharpness. But Jesse had anticipated this response and was already diving left, his Colt clearing leather with practice speed. Both weapons discharged simultaneously, their combined reports echoing across the desert like thunder. Jesse felt Valdez's bullet pass his ear close enough to singe hair and leave his hearing ringing. His own shot, fired with veteran marksman's steady nerves, took the gunman's center mass with devastating effect. The heavy slug punched through Valdez's chest, spinning him around and slamming his body back against the boulder. He tried working his rifle's lever for a second shot, but strength was fading as blood filled his punctured lung. "Should have minded your own business," he gasped, rifle finally falling from nerveless fingers. "Maybe so." Jesse agreed, keeping his Colt trained on the dying man. But some things are worth the risk. Pete Valdez died as he'd lived violently and without redemption. His final breath whistled through the hole in his chest as his eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight. Jesse quickly cut Abigail's bonds and helped her to unsteady feet, his arms encircling her as she collapsed against his chest, shaking with relief and delayed reaction to hours of terror. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his shirt. "I watched you disappear under that water. Takes more than a flash flood to kill an old cavalry horse." Jesse replied, though his voice betrayed how close it had been. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal." Abigail pulled back to study his face in flickering firelight. "But we need to return to town. My father must be frantic. He's probably beside himself, but he's safe for now. I saw riders heading toward that canyon. Your disappearance didn't go unnoticed." Jesse began gathering supplies from Valdez's camp. "But you're right about returning home. There'll be questions requiring answers." They rode through pre-dawn darkness, pushing horses harder than advisable, but driven by urgent need to reach civilization before news of the night's events spread beyond their control. As the sun crested eastern mountains, painting the desert in gold and copper, they saw landmarks marking the approach to Perdition Valley. The town they returned to bore little resemblance to the community they'd left. Word of Silas Crowley's disappearance and Billy Crane's body discovery had spread through Perdition Valley like wildfire, creating panic that threatened to consume everything. The sheriff, who owed his position to Crowley's influence, found himself facing questions he couldn't answer and accusations he couldn't dismiss. Without his patron's protection, the systematic corruption that had poisoned local law enforcement stood exposed like infected wound in bright sunlight. Citizens who'd remained silent for years were suddenly finding their voices and demanding accountability. Thomas Hart met them at town's outskirts, his relief at seeing his daughter alive temporarily overwhelming his fear of consequences. "Thank God you're both safe," he said, embracing Abigail as she dismounted. "I've been beside myself with worry." "We're fine, Pa, but we have significant problems," Abigail replied, noting tension in her father's voice. "What's the situation?" "Crowley's remaining men claim you murdered their boss and stole his property. They're talking about organizing a vigilante posse." Thomas's voice carried weight of a man who'd seen too much violence. "And without Crowley's protection, our debt situation hasn't improved. The bank still demands full payment." Abigail reached into her bodice and withdrew the leather-wrapped document she'd protected through all their trials. "We need to get this to the territorial courthouse in Santa Fe. Once the real mineral rights situation is clarified, everything else will fall into place." But before they could discuss their next moves, a new complication emerged from the gathered crowd. A tall man in black suit and clerical collar pushed through the assembly, his face set with determination. "Miss Hart," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "I'm Reverend Samuel Morrison. I believe you encountered my brother Jack during your recent ordeal." Abigail's blood ran cold. If this man sought revenge for his brother's death, Jack spoke of you often in his letters. The Reverend continued his tone, suggesting complexity beyond simple vengeance. Not always kindly, but his most recent correspondence mentioned serious concerns about his employer's methods. Concerns that proved tragically justified. Jesse kept his hand near his gun, uncertain where this led. "I've spent days investigating the circumstances surrounding my brother's death," Reverend Morrison explained. "What I've discovered has convinced me that justice requires more than revenge. It demands truth." From his coat, he produced a substantial bundle of papers that immediately drew everyone's attention. Jack kept detailed records of his work for Mr. Crowley over 5 years. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements about various questionable practices. He sent copies to me for safekeeping in case something happened to him. The crowd pressed closer as implications became clear. If Jack Morrison had documented Crowley's criminal activities systematically, it would explain not only recent violence, but also the systematic corruption that had plagued the valley. There's sufficient evidence here to prove that Silas Crowley engaged in fraud, extortion, kidnapping, attempted murder, and systematic theft of land and mineral rights. The Reverend continued with authority of a man accustomed to speaking truth to power. "My brother may not have been completely good, but he wasn't a fool. He understood his employer was heading for serious trouble and wanted insurance." But then Reverend Morrison revealed the most shocking information. 3 weeks ago, Jack sent me a letter asking me to watch for Union Cavalry veteran Jesse Boone. He'd heard through old Army contacts that Jesse might be in the territory, and he wanted me to pass along a warning. The Reverend looked directly at Jesse. "You saved my life during a skirmish outside Atlanta in 1864. Jack never forgot that debt." Jesse stared in amazement. "Sam Morrison, you were barely 16 carrying dispatches for General Wheeler's cavalry. Jack arranged for you to be in that desert at exactly the right time to rescue Miss Hart. He sent word through channels he knew you'd trust, telling you about a woman in danger." The Reverend's voice carried deep emotion. "He died trying to do the right thing, finally, after years serving the wrong cause." Jesse felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "I never understood why that letter found me when it did, or why the description was so detailed. Jack was trying to make amends. There's more," the Reverend continued. Jack suspected Crowley was after more than water rights, so he made his own investigation. He found this. He produced another document from his coat. A copy of your mother's real will, Miss Hart. The one Jack discovered hidden in Crowley's safe. Abigail took the document with trembling hands. As she read, her eyes widened with understanding. This version has additional pages, she said. It explains the coded language in the will I've been carrying. Mother wasn't just protecting Aunt Sarah's silver claim, she was protecting evidence that Crowley had already murdered Sarah to try to get the claim. When that failed because of territorial law, he turned his attention to us. The revelation sent a murmur through the crowd. Crowley hadn't just been a greedy cattle baron. He'd been a calculating murderer who'd killed Sarah Hart and would have killed Abigail too. Over the next several hours, as documents were examined by the territorial judge summoned from Santa Fe, the full scope of Crowley's criminal enterprise became clear. The cattle baron had been systematically seizing water rights, mineral claims, and prime grazing land throughout the region through elaborate combination of legal manipulation and outright violence. But more importantly, Jack Morrison's records included correspondence proving the existence and location of significant silver deposits on Sarah Hart's former claim. With Crowley dead and his organization disbanded, legal obstacles to claiming that land had largely evaporated. The territorial government is prepared to offer the Hart family exclusive mining rights to your aunt's property, the judge announced. This is offered in recognition of grave injustices you've suffered and valuable public service you've provided. But Abigail's response surprised everyone and demonstrated the depth of her character. I don't want exclusive mining rights for my family, she said quietly but firmly. I want those rights sold at public auction, with all proceeds used to compensate every person who lost property or suffered damages because of Crowley's schemes. The crowd murmured with surprise and growing approval. Here was justice that transcended personal gain and addressed broader harm inflicted on their community. That's unusually generous, Miss Hart, the judge observed, clearly impressed. Are you certain? My mother always taught me that water was meant to be shared, not hoarded. I believe the same principle applies to silver. Abigail looked around at her neighbors, many facing financial ruin because of Crowley's manipulations. This community suffered together. It should prosper together. As legal formalities were completed and arrangements made for the public auction, Jesse found himself facing a decision he'd been avoiding. His original plan had been to see Abigail safely home and resume his wandering existence. But the events of recent days had changed something fundamental in his outlook. The prospect of endless drifting no longer held appeal when measured against the possibility of building something meaningful with a remarkable woman who'd shown such courage. Where will you go now? Abigail asked as they stood together outside the courthouse, watching sunset over their valley. I've been giving that considerable thought, Jesse replied, studying her face in golden evening light. Spent 3 years running from my past, trying to forget what the war took from all of us. But maybe it's time to stop running and start building something worthwhile. The ranch could use another experienced hand, Abigail suggested carefully. Someone with your skills would be invaluable. The pay wouldn't amount to much, but I'm not looking for wages, Jesse interrupted gently. I'm looking for a reason to put down roots, a purpose beyond just surviving. Abigail met his eyes steadily. And have you found such a reason? Jesse's answer came not in words, but in actions. He stepped closer, reached up to touch her face with gentle reverence, and kissed her with all the careful tenderness of a man who'd learned the true value of the precious things. When they broke apart, both were smiling with quiet happiness of people who'd found their place in the world. I reckon I have, he said softly. Later that evening, as they sat with Thomas Hart on the ranch porch, Jesse shared one final story about the war and Jack Morrison's brother. I never knew Sam had a brother until today, Jesse said, watching stars emerge over the valley. During that skirmish in Georgia, Sam took a Confederate bullet in the chest. I carried him 2 miles through enemy territory to reach a field hospital. He was just a kid scared out of his mind, but brave as any soldier I ever knew. Jack mentioned in his letters that Sam often spoke of the cavalry trooper who saved his life. Thomas observed. Said it changed Sam's whole outlook on what really mattered. Maybe that's why Jack decided to help us in the end, Abigail suggested. He understood what his brother learned that day, that some debts of honor transcend everything else. Jesse nodded thoughtfully. Jack Morrison died trying to balance the scales for all the wrong he'd done working for Crowley. In his own way, he found redemption. The silver mine auction, held 3 weeks later under territorial supervision, generated enough revenue to pay off every fraudulent debt Crowley had created and provide substantial seed money for legitimate business development throughout Perdition Valley. The Hart family retained their water rights and ranch, now completely free of financial encumbrance. More importantly, they'd gained the respect and support of a community that had learned the value of standing together against corruption and tyranny. Jesse Boone settled into life as a rancher, with the same methodical competence he'd brought to military service, finding peace in honest work and good people's company. Within 6 months, he and Abigail were married in a ceremony, attended by the entire town, including Reverend Morrison, who performed the service as his contribution to the healing process. Thomas Hart lived to see his first grandchildren and witness complete transformation of Perdition Valley, from a community ruled by fear into one governed by cooperation and mutual respect. Water from their spring continued flowing freely, supporting not just their own livestock, but also neighbors' dreams and aspirations. And on quiet evenings, when desert winds sang through cottonwoods and setting sun painted western sky in shades of fire and gold, Jesse and Abigail would sit on their porch and watch stars emerge over a valley that had finally fulfilled its potential for peace, prosperity, and justice. The desert had tested them all with trials that would have broken lesser people, and found them worthy of the second chances it so rarely offered. In the end, that proved to be the greatest treasure of all. Not silver or gold, but knowledge that courage, love, and moral principle could triumph over greed and violence when people stood together for what was right. The judgment of the desert had been rendered, and for once justice had prevailed in a land where such victories were as precious and rare as water in the depths of summer.